I believe we are live.
We're live. All right.
On suicide and stuff.
As usual, I am very excited about suicide and stuff tonight. And should we do intros first or should we do our rating first?
Up to you.
Let's start with the rating.
Okay, we have a rating.
We have a rating. We're rated R for language, terror, and some disturbing images. Which makes me laugh every time. So, yeah, Des and I have our boys. Des and I will always swear, and sometimes our guests swear if they feel comfortable doing that. And we'll talk about the difficult content because this is a show called Suicide and Stuff, so you can expect that. I am very, very excited because we have Jennifer White on today. I'm Jess Stohlmann-Rainey, and I work at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners in Denver, Colorado. We serve the state with a peer support and crisis line, and I do work in the suicidology field, usually rabble-rousing kinds of work if I have the energy for that. And that's kind of what tonight is all about. So we have 3 rabble-rousing people, which is very exciting to me. Des, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run the Live Through This project, which is a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors across the U.S. I don't know, I also do a couple of other things, and mostly this week I do a lot of yelling on Twitter.
All right, Jennifer, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Jennifer White, and I'm here in Victoria, BC, which is on the unceded territory of the Lekwungen people. And I think it's always good to acknowledge that the work that I'm doing and where I live and where I study is on stolen land. And I think it's always good to begin there because that helps us situate the whole issue of suicide in a context, in a particular context. And I think that one's important to say. And I'm a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at UVic, and I've been there, I think, going on 15 years now. And I've been probably working in suicide prevention for 30 years. I was thinking I was at the first Canadian Association for Suicide Prevention conference in 1990. So long time.
Long time to be putting up with a lot of shit.
Yes, indeed. And sometimes I didn't even know it at the beginning. It took me a long time to figure that out.
Tell us about how you started out in the field. What sort of draws you to this work?
Sure. I really gave that some thought because I knew you were going to ask me that. And I thought, my very first recollection of being interested in suicide was literally in high school. And I think I invited someone from the Salvation Army, if I'm not mistaken, for a presentation to come and talk to our class. So I was obviously curious about it, interested in it. I wasn't myself suicidal, and I think I just felt curious about this life-death thing and what made people feel like life wasn't worth living anymore. And I was curious about that. And then I worked, my very first job when I graduated with my undergrad degree was as a child and youth care counselor in a big residential care facility in Calgary. And I remember when I first started there'd been a young person who hanged themselves in a locked confinement of all things. And what I remember, and this is disturbing to me because it makes me realize my complicity with harm, but what came of that wasn't a conversation about what this young woman, I think she was about 16, was going through to feel so despairing and hopeless to kill herself, but it was more procedures. It was, if we're going to lock people up, we need to make sure we take away any belts or ligatures or shoelaces. We need to fill out these forms. We need to report it. And it was like, at the time, again, I just like went along with this, like, okay, I'm going to follow the procedures. And I kind of liked, I think at the time, the certainty of everything. It was clean and tidy and tied down. And it wasn't until years later when I got more involved in the field. I worked as a counselor and a researcher and so on. And this might have been the seeds of my early critiques and rabble-rousing. It's like, oh my God, we didn't even ask ourselves the ethics of locking people up. Or was this a good thing to be doing for people who were feeling such despair and hopelessness? But we were talking totally procedurally. And I think that's common in our field. We talk a lot about procedures like risk assessments and forms and getting things filled out and right. And sometimes we bypass the conversation of ethics. So it's kind of a long-winded way of saying, I've been involved in suicide prevention for many years as a practitioner primarily. I think I was involved, in the very first iteration of Living Works training. That was a research subject when Roger Tierney was developing that model of the 2-day assist workshop. So yeah, it goes back a long way, which is old, but I have put up with a lot in that time in the field, and learned a lot and questioned a lot too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I've always felt like a weird outsider in suicide prevention until Leah Harris gave me the critical suicidology book that you edited, and I was like, oh, this is it. There are people who believe the same things as me, and it's just this idea of like centering ethics, and then there are lots of ways to like come to know things about suicide and to come to know things about how intervention or prevention or support should look was so great to me. It was just I heard so much about like, risk assessment and mandatory reporting and imminent risk and things like that. Nobody was talking about like liberation as a part of this work. So it was really, really transformative for me to just feel connected to other work. So I'll make sure we put a link to that book in the chats on Facebook and Twitter and things like that. But that book is is edited by you and Ian Marsh and Michael Kroll and Jonathan Morris. And I know you've had the Critical Suicide Studies Network has had some conferences and things like that, but I'm really interested in how all of that kind of came about.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm just so thrilled to hear you say you found your people when you read that book, because I felt the exact same way when I met Ian Marsh, who wrote that amazing book on suicide history and Foucault. It was an amazing book.
It's
and
so good.
that same feeling is like there's other people that are calling into question this whole project in a really thoughtful, scholarly way. And it was that same feeling. And so then literally, I think Ian published his book in 2010, and I was publishing an article, I think, with Johnny Morris around the same time called Precarious Spaces. And we were critiquing youth suicide prevention in the classroom and the standard approach and how they were positioning young people as kind of fragile and not very knowledgeable. And they were often positioned as service recipients always, and not people who had capacities for care and so on. Anyway, I think it was through that article, and I think it turned out Ian might have been one of the peer reviewers of that article. I can't remember, but we ended up meeting and we realized like, oh, we've got to come together. And so, we actually presented at AAS in 2015 in Austin. I looked that up because I thought
I missed that one.
AAS, and we felt like we were transgressing the norm, because I'd been to AAS conferences before. I sort of knew the drill, and I thought, well, no one's going to want to talk about critiquing suicide prevention. And it was really well attended, and people were ready for it.
Yeah, I was there at that presentation.
Were you really? Oh, that's so great to hear.
Yep, that
wasn't there yet.
Serious fandom started.
Oh, that's so great. We were nervous. We thought, oh my gosh, people are not going to be receptive to these ideas, but we were pleasantly surprised.
I got some readings from the critical suicidology text into my MSW program.
Awesome. Well, this is how it begins, right? Like that there becomes, a movement and a coalition and a network of people who are saying, let's mobilize these knowledges so that they're kind of infiltrating, and that soon enough it becomes sort of natural. Like the fact that there is even a thing now called critical suicide studies is great to me. Like there's a conference and there's a network and there's special issues of journals. And this is, I think, how you begin to change the discourse.
Yeah. I taught a PsyD class last year, and I taught the critical suicidology book along with sort of the traditional intervention stuff. And it was so interesting. I think in PsyD programs in particular, they're not used to engaging with content in the way that I was asking them to with the book. So it was so hard for the students, but also they were so excited about it. They really, really loved being able to both learn what the things their field requires them to do and be invited to challenge that and think about ways that they can work within systems to do things in better ways. So I think it's really, really important that, as we think about changing the field, it doesn't have to be everything all at once. It's like lots of individual people can do small things that really push the field to behave differently. And there are big things, of course, that can happen too. But
I totally agree with you about this kind of modest incremental changes can make big differences. And we don't have to go for the full revolution right all at once. I agree with you. And I think the thing we've often said, and I know I've said this publicly many times, is critical suicidology isn't attempting to replace what is with something else. It's not saying we've got the answers and that's all bad what's been going on, but it's saying let's make room for more possibilities to play. So more ways of accessing help or thinking about care or thinking about suicide that enables just different responses so that everybody doesn't get the standard universal approach that we've been led to believe is somehow there's a generic suicidal person and everybody's going to benefit from DBT or CBT or
But suicide is a very complex phenomenon, so we all need the same response.
Des has been extremely frustrated about the hypocrisy in the field lately. Just it's like resurfacing that frustration, and I think
tons of contradictions. And the one about reach out for help, talk, get help, and then if you show up having self-harmed, often you'll be treated with such harsh treatment and judgment, and tons of contradictions throughout.
Right. Ask for help, but don't be malingering.
Ask for help, but don't ask for attention.
No.
You don't want that.
Worthy of help. Your identity.
And I think one of the things that really struck me is I don't come to this work through a behavioral health kind of field. I don't have a degree in psychology or social work. My background is in education and in gender studies and women's studies and sort of critical theory. So one of the things that really struck me about how suicide prevention operates is so focused on this sort of psychological framework that really has been able to ignore all kinds of other factors that impact people's lives for so long. And what was really refreshing to me about the critical suicidology book and in general the folks involved in that community is that there are people from lots of different disciplines with lots of different approaches that can give us something that's useful to use in our suicide prevention practice. So I thought particularly addressing things like talking about poetry and thinking about Foucault in this context and that kind of stuff was really exciting to me.
But you're lucky that you didn't come from a background in psychology. You didn't have to do so much unlearning.
Right. So much of that.
It became a natural, taken for granted idea, and it was so beyond questioning that suicide was equated with mental disorder, and it's an individual quality that you need to act upon the individual. And it's when you open that up and say, well, it doesn't have to be that way. That's made up stuff.
Yeah. Did you feel like you went through an unlearning process?
Huge, huge. I mean, in the beginning of my career, as I said, like I worked as a counselor, I did a lot of education, and I was marching to the evidence-based practice beat for sure. I was producing that kind of material. But there was always a part of me that felt a, an unease and a disenchantment. I thought it sounds neat and tidy, but I knew it wasn't. It didn't quite fit into the boxes. And I think it was my own doctoral research, probably when I went back to school, that opened the curtain, kind of like you could actually think otherwise about this stuff. It's not required to think this way. And this inheritance of an individualizing biomedical, as you say, psychological self was not required. It could be thought differently, and we could think about suicide as a relational project and as a relational issue and a socio-political issue. It didn't have to be a psychological issue at all, or only, or exclusively.
Yeah.
But yes, I did. I had to do a lot of unlearning, and then I had to figure out, and you alluded to this, and this is probably true for you too, Jess, is like how to be a clinician or how to be a practitioner where you actually want to make a practical, useful difference to people who are suicidal. You actually have to sometimes do this double practice where you're doing the work and critiquing it at the same time and figuring out a way forward that can be useful.
Yeah. Yeah, I think to me there's my sort of like focal point of the sort of justice stuff that I care about related to this is around forced treatment, and I work for a crisis line, and like we have requirements about calling 911 for our contracts, and I feel like it hurts my heart every single day that I work in a place where I teach people to and encourage people to use interventions that I don't think are ethical. And I think there's such a benefit in having someone with my perspective there in a position of leadership where we have conversations with our practitioners about that exact issue. We talk about like, what are your values and what is the law and how do you navigate these things? And that we can't go into this work without unpacking our attitudes and beliefs about it. Which I think is something that's so lacking in the practice space, is that like we don't ask people to think about what their values are. So it's almost as if we think that because there are laws about something or because there's some maybe guidance in your field that you don't have your own beliefs, and then people act on those beliefs, these like deeply held beliefs that they think are just facts about the world or whatever, and they act about them in ways that really harm people. So we're missing a big step there.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and I think that complicating our practices is not for the faint of heart, right? Like some people want the orderly, tidy, do A, B, C, D. But when you actually sit with the contradictions and the complications and our implication in potentially harmful practices that calls on us to think ethically in a different way, it's a different kind of practice, but it's the kind of world that I sure want to be more a part of than the other kind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you're talking to someone and they're like, oh man, everything you're saying is really, really fascinating. So what do I do? Like, what are the steps? And it's like, no, there are no steps.
Yeah.
This is just a process that's never going to end, and it's going to be very painful. Enjoy.
Yeah. Well, and don't you also think, like, and this is certainly true for young people, is they know all that stuff. So if they come to see a counselor, they know exactly what's going to happen. They can write the script, they can say the words. And it's what I've often called a kind of a deadening conversation. It's not a livening conversation. There's nothing fresh about it. There's nothing interesting about it. There's nothing that invites them to think differently about their situation or their lives. It's just like, yes, we'll go through the risk assessment, and yes, we're going to do the safety plan. And I'm not one to say that none of those things can be helpful, and I think they're life-saving to many, but I think that sometimes they just become so rote and so predictable and so stale that they do nothing to recognize the person in their particular
Yeah.
context. Yeah.
I think especially if you're someone who's been assessed before, right?
Mhm.
So if you're not new to a risk assessment, like you know exactly when it starts, you know what the next question's gonna be. I mean, especially if someone's gonna use the Columbia scale, I know the whole
Yeah.
the whole drill. I'm like, why don't I just tell you my numbers all the way down?
Well, and I was just interviewing some mental health practitioners recently for a study I'm doing, and they say similarly, like it's almost like you've got to get that stuff out of the way. And I think they said something like, and then we can get on to the real work, right?
Yeah.
Get through the risk assessments, get through the things that are required by the institution to meet their standards of care, and then let's get on with the important work of having a conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I feel like you particularly do work with young people, which I think is this interesting space where people's intensity about needing evidence-based practice and risk assessment and using coercion is really heightened in that space. So I imagine doing sort of critical work in that space is really interesting and difficult. So what are some of the unique things about the sort of youth space to you?
Yeah. Well, it's true that there's, I think, even greater fear than normal. I mean, there's already so much anxiety and fear about suicide, but I think when we're talking about young people, it's even heightened all the more. And yet, when people are operating from a place of high anxiety and fear, they're probably not in the most grounded place to have a conversation with a young person. So, as I said, I've been doing this study recently where I've been interviewing mental health clinicians about their work when young people show up. And they do sort of, that's why I use that language of this doubled practice. They sort of know what the institution requires of them, and they don't refuse to do it. It's not they're non-compliant. They do it, but they know there's something else that needs to take place for them to have a relationship with the young person. And so I think this work that they're doing that I'm coming to understand is really about being open to hanging, and this is, you two know this well, is being open to hanging in there with someone as they're feeling that absolute despair of wanting to kill themselves, and not rushing in with a safety plan, not saying, well, we can fix this or we've got treatment for that, but actually being absolutely able to hold that and have the confidence and the grounding in oneself that this could be, a useful conversation without letting fear get the better of oneself. So, because I think it's fear that's driving all of that. The procedures, kind of going back to my first story, is like the procedural thing alleviated people's fears and anxiety somehow if we've got the right procedures. Yeah. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
When people are afraid, that's when they start relying even more on like the checklist of
more
did I do everything right and
control.
And also this like wanting to push liability to someone else. I think this might be something that's very American. I'm not totally sure, but I know there are whole organizational policies that are written, and it appears that they are written to basically move that person into someone else's care so that somebody else has the liability of dealing with them as soon as suicide is talked about, especially with young people. So like the school wants to get someone from the mental health field involved in the mental health field. Basically, it's like push all the way until they're in hospitalization, and then like, wait, we hold them for 3 days and let them go, and we did everything we could. It was sort of the that's sort of what is happening there.
Quite the same litigious country that you do, but there's certainly concerns about liability, and absolutely the same is true. And so even when I ask questions of these mental health clinicians to say, well, who is this benefiting, this suicide risk assessment? And they always say, well, the organization,
right,
helping the client. It's not the client that's benefiting the most from that. It's the organization, so that they can sort of say, we've followed the standards, we've got the procedures in place, and we've done the right thing. And people say things, and nobody wants to have a suicide on their watch, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like it's anytime I have a conversation with someone who's talking about suicide or talking about being suicidal, I feel like there's a fear, like you don't want to lose someone. I don't feel like those conversations will ever stop being scary, but I also don't feel like we should stop having them. And so, when people are asking me, how do I have the conversation? I tell them, and then I say, I don't think that it will ever not feel scary for you, but you run towards the fear or whatever the fancy quote is, you got to do it.
Agreed. Yeah, it's not that it'll just be easy, because then there's probably something that you're not connecting to if it just feels like easy conversation, but to stay with it. And I think I was mentioning maybe to both of you on Twitter a while ago, a friend of mine was in a really dark suicidal place, and she was subject to a lot of this kind of suicide risk assessment and safety planning. And she said the most profound thing to me. She said, there's more to my life than safety. Like, I don't want to live a life that's predicated on safety alone. It just feels so small to aspire to a safe life.
Yeah. And who's defining the safety too?
Yeah.
I bet it wasn't her.
No. And it wasn't even what she wanted out of life, a safe life.
Right.
Yeah.
The idea that safety is the goal, and that there's like a definition of safety, right? Even safety plans to me are interesting because they're still defining safety around the terms of the providers, like the providers are like, safety means you're not going to die. Well, like, living is quite a big risk when you're suicidal. And I think we just ignore that.
Yeah,
that is true.
All right. Let's see what else we should talk about. So I'm looking at my notes to make sure I check in on things. Is it time for Beef Corner, Des, do you think?
Is it? It could be time for Beef Corner.
For Beef Corner.
All right, let me find my video. Jen's going to enjoy this.
A little beef introduction video.
Our official Beef Corner video.
That's awesome.
It's really long. Like, it's uncomfortably long this time too. I think I'm never going to change it.
Oh, yeah. So I know really we mostly spend the whole time on beefs, but I'm interested in hearing about your current biggest beefs with suicidology.
Yes.
With suicidology. I was calling to mind, like, again, sometimes all the worst things happen at the conferences, like those big massive conferences. Like, those in themselves, I have a huge beef with. I just remember, I call to mind like a big fancy hotel with chandeliers and a lot of white men kind of presiding over the, process. That's what I call to mind when I think about AAS in particular. Yeah. And I think it's changing, and I'm grateful for that. And I'm sure both of you have probably had something to do with that. But that's like, for me, that was when it was at its pinnacle, peak whiteness, I guess, for suicidology. And I remember being, and this wasn't at an AAS conference, maybe it was even a CASP, a Canadian Association Suicide Prevention Conference. And I remember I was on a panel, and it was one of these things that someone who had a case that each of us were supposed to speak to, how we would handle the case. And, there was a psychiatrist and a researcher, and I think a distress sign person, and so the case was introduced with a lot of detail about their particular symptomology and stuff. And I think I was about the fourth person, and all I said was, "What's the person's name?" And that changed everything, because all the previous speakers were talking about their diagnostics and what the likelihood of relapse was. They were not even talking, in my view, about a human being. And so I remember interrupting that train with that one comment about what person's name. And of course, the person who'd invented the case, he said the name, like there was no name, there was no thought that this person was a person. Really, it was a bundle of risk factors and symptoms that people were, in some ways, I thought, what I caught myself participating in a little bit. It was like, we are performing our expert knowledge up here on a panel, right? We're showcasing what we know, and you know, how you're supposed to handle a case. And I remember that there was like this such a small moment, like you were saying, like a modest moment, but powerful.
Yeah.
To interrupt that. So those are beefs for sure. That kind of way of speaking about people, and I think it's changing. I do. But the other one I sometimes get off on, and again, I'm not in your context in the States where I know zero suicide is, you know, a big deal and there's lots about it. I got into a kind of a Twitter storm a few years ago about zero suicide with people, you know, so zealous about it, like that it's so important. And who's going to argue to say, well, no, we need this many more suicides, not zero? I mean, but the rhetorical force of it is that it gets missed that you could prevent suicide at any cost by locking people up. I mean, like people aren't going to kill themselves if they're shackled to their beds or medically, you know, restrained. But that's not the kind of world I want to live in, and it's not the kind of thing I think we're prepared to do. So it's like, at what level does it become coercive to achieve the goal of zero, right? And so those are the questions I'm interested in that people, I think, don't always talk about front and center. And so those are just a couple off the top. Is expert knowledge, big beef. I have a big beef with that.
Yeah.
You know, throwing science around like it's unquestionable and that it can't be thought a different way, or relegating other people's knowledge and experience as less valuable, or even the separation from expert knowledge to people with lived experiences if they're not together, that they have both or multiple identities. So those ways that we do that drives me nuts.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was sort of the first place that I started being sort of openly critical about suicidology. Was I had gotten a presentation in an AAS, and it was like one of the first ones I had gotten accepted on my own, where I wasn't presenting about a program or something that I was participating in. And originally I started out and I wanted to just address the sort of the way we talk about gender and suicide. And as I started kind of getting deeper into it, I was like, no, this is more about the way that we think about knowledge. And there's a gendered nature to that too. But I did this presentation, and I was in one of the, you know, when you know that they were like, we let this presentation in, but we don't think anyone's going to go. So you're in the tiniest room, and it was packed. So I was terrified because I had decided I was going to go off, not present what I had submitted first. I was going to just present something else. And there's like 100 people in this tiny room. And basically I was like, I've changed my mind. We're going to talk about epistemology, and just talking about this idea of like expertise and all of the gatekeeping and how all of that like sort of works against the purported idea of suicide prevention, which is that we would help people, and all of it is sort of like we're all locked behind these paywalls. All of the information is locked behind paywalls from the people who are probably most needing to access it, and we only count things that are produced as knowledge by the academy, and it's not only that, it's like the things that are also affirming what already exists, right? So if we're going to deviate from any kind of model of understanding suicide that's not like an ideation to action kind of framework, then whatever you're doing is not considered useful, I think, in the field. So it's so interesting though, because people seem so hungry for something different. Like whenever there's something at a conference or in a space where people can access something different, they're so excited for it.
I agree.
Yeah. Was that the Saturday talk, Jess? It was like late in the day. Everyone was leaving.
Yeah. It's like, it's like the last session on a Saturday. And I was like, how did so many people show up for this? Like, I didn't even know anyone here.
Yeah, I busted in there with my suitcase. I was like, I'm going to be here for 10 minutes. Okay.
But you know what my other beef is, and this might be changing too, but I remember this used to get me, and like the patronizing way that people who were survivors or people with lived experience, where their stories had to be sort of sanitized for fear of contagion, and like, oh no, you can't say that, and no, you can't use this image, and that was a big beef of mine too.
Yeah.
Girl, tell us about
Well,
it.
yeah, like filter it through the expert lens so it can become a powerful story that does nothing.
Right. Yeah. Make sure you tell us about how you're hopeful now. Like, yeah. That's one of my big. I have a big beef about that. I wrote an article for Mad in America about safe messaging and how it's, basically gaslighting. That was interesting. People were a little bit challenged by, I think, but yeah.
But I think even at conferences again, and maybe it is the conferences are the place where all of that is visible, that gatekeeping, that, having, I remember early on is like volunteers need to be standing at the ready in case somebody's like vulnerable and people are being swooped on, like given risk assessments and things like that. And it's just like it's just a funny way that we perform this idea that suicide prevention is to be done by experts.
Yeah.
And that only experts have what it takes to kind of assess and surveil people and determine what's needed. And even if a peer reaches out, it's always to push them over to, formal services. And that's hugely problematic in my view.
Yeah. I mean, you can only have a crisis between 9 and 5. Otherwise, you're fucked.
And they're all predicated on the idea that suicidal crises are time-bound, time-limited, not just something that someone lives with forever or a lifetime. Or like they're always like, okay, well, we'll have this short-term thing, and then we have the plan, and it's always like a crisis or catastrophe. But that's not how it is for everybody.
No.
Yeah. I think that's how it is for most people.
Yeah. I'm in like a long-term relationship with suicide.
Same. Don't love it, but we're here.
Yeah.
It's
you have some beefs?
I have all the beefs. All of the beefs.
I had too many.
You did not have too many.
No.
It's so funny, like when I talk to you guys and as I'm, continuing to learn, I think of all of us had the most unlearning to do, because I showed up and I became, the prize survivor for a minute until I started telling everyone to fuck off. As nice as I could. But that was really, it was difficult. It was difficult to feel that and to be watching, the ways people would accept the ideas, but only so far. And as the deeper I get into talking to people who are working through this lens and my social work studies, the more I realize I've been doing this stuff for much longer than I even really knew. I just didn't have the language or the frame for it. The idea that people experience suicidal thoughts over the course of a lifetime was, it's just so obvious to me. But here we have suicide prevention or whatever saying, no, it's one and done. Collectivism, all of these things, these ideas that just come out that I didn't have a framework for. So I love having these conversations. My beef, I hate this month. Like, if I could just put September and Florida together and like cut them off and send them on their way. You put the month of September on Florida, turn it to an island and send it away. That's what I would do. I'm from Florida.
September is terrible, right? I mean, this
really is.
I've decided I'm just not acknowledging Suicide Prevention Month. I'm not talking about it on my social media, really. I'm just not.
Yeah.
In the past,
I did that last year.
Angry.
I did that last year, but like, I had a 5-month-old then, and I was like, I don't give a shit about anything.
Yeah.
But this baby. This year, I don't know. I'm not trying to come up with content. Things just keep showing up in my Twitter feed that make me very angry. And then I start typing and I don't stop.
Yeah.
Like an hour later, I'm like, oh, well, that became an essay. Okay, cool. Yeah, I'm really, how long are we going to regurgitate the same useless shit? It's not helping suicidal people, and it's not helping people who do this work. So I'm not sure who it's helping.
Well, it's keeping the industry going, right? This massive industry. The conferences, the journals, the research careers, and the whole suicide literacy thing, like this idea again, like that you're going to just go out and teach people these facts, and you'll master the facts, and that's the only way to engage with this. Yeah, I don't know. It's such a good question. How long will we keep up with it while the rates keep going up, or at least stay the same? Particularly around, here in Canada, the rates, and I think it's the same in the States, among Indigenous people are disproportionately high.
Yeah.
And don't do anything about colonization and colonial violence and racism. And the fact that many of these communities don't have access to clean drinking water or equitable services for their children. And we keep wanting to say, let's memorize the risk factors and the warning signs. It's like, that's a bit of a disconnect.
Yeah.
It's problematic.
Or like maybe we should add things to the risk factors that we know are actually risk factors, like colonization. It's like
structural change.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's what we need to do, is put pressure on the government to do the right thing.
Right. Yeah, the risk factor, just don't locate them within the person at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Look elsewhere. I don't know. It's just so frustrating at this point. And I used to feel really pressured into participating, because live through this, I guess for me, it was always like, live through this is the message that I want people to have. I want people to know that there are so many of us who have lived, and we're mostly okay. Sometimes we're not, but God, at what cost? You know? At what cost? I don't know that we need to be.
What you're doing is a counter narrative to the mainstream suicide. You already are doing, like, that is your contribution. And I just sent that link out just last week to somebody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Des kind of like became the like suicide attempt survivor of the moment, while I was like not very out about being a suicide attempt survivor at that time, in the field, because everybody tells you, like, if you do any work in the field, that you won't have any respect if you're out as a suicide attempt survivor or whatever. And then like what happened with Des, where it was like, it was so gross, like people everybody like wanted a piece of you, and they wanted you to like bleed on a stage. And I was like, I never want to do that. I never want this to happen to me. But it also really, for like seeing that happen, sorry, Des, this was at your expense, but seeing that happen, like, really created space, I think, for me to be like, okay, like, how do I move into a space of like talking about my experience, in a way that's different and doesn't let them do this same thing to me. And so I kind of came in really hot about like forced treatment.
You did not fuck around.
No, I came in hot. And then I think the other thing, the other big space for me was like then to also be talking about being a person who's voice hearing. Like, there's no space for that in suicidology, or there hadn't been. I don't know if there is now. We'll see. So that was really interesting and intentional on my part, is like to not be someone that people want to come out, tell their story for like their suicide prevention day. Like, nobody asked me to come bleed on the stage for that. That's for sure. They're not unfortunate to do that the same way either. Though Does, I think you kind of turned that around a little bit, that people are wanting something different now.
Yeah, it's easier for me. The longer I go, the more of my own story I cut out, You know, I've been doing this for 10 years now. Today is like the 10th birthday I've lived through this, actually.
Yeah.
So yeah, the longer I go, the more of me I cut out, because it's not about me. It's about all of these people. So yeah, that's actually, I really love that. I love that I still get to do this work and I don't have to be the stage bleeding on the stage, as it were.
Yeah, like the story can't get co-opted by the mainstream to be told in that way that is a nice, tidy narrative that maps onto the interventions that suicide prevention and the mainstream wants to. Yeah, I think that's great. It's disruptive and it shifts the way we think about it. And that's what we need.
Yeah.
We need stories like that.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I hate that things had to happen at my expense. It was really interesting to see all of the people who just disappear when you stop saying shit that is palatable. But, you know, it leaves you with the people you want to work with and the work that you want to do. So it hurt, but I'm grateful for it, honestly.
Well, and I think that's kind of what we felt like in critical suicidology. You know, like we were kind of a ragtag bunch that literally just came together and thought, let's start writing. And then, as you say, you just discover there's more of us out there. And then that becomes its own movement. And then, of course, that became its own challenge, too. It's like, oh, gosh, now how are we going to have a conference and we might have to turn people away? Or, like, now are we going to have insiders and outsiders to critical suicidology? And none of us wanted that. We wanted it to be open, and democratic, and diverse. But it becomes a challenge when you become not so much on the margins anymore, where you're in the center.
Yeah. Oh, that was a long beef corner, but I think it segued into not beef corner.
Yeah. I'm interested in kind of what are the newer things you're thinking about? What kinds of directions are you thinking about heading with your work, or things you want to see in the fields, that kind of stuff?
Well, thanks for asking. I'm working with a great group of people on this project that's trying to look at, for lack of a better word, it would be promoting life in online spaces. So we've been working with a group of young people as part of our advisory group. We've been having focus groups with young people to talk about their experience online. And of course, most of us these days are online. That's where we're living our lives. So there isn't a big distinction. But trying again to not just come up with more apps of, you know, how to be looking after yourself or be more mindful or problem solve your way out of a suicidal despair. There's tons of that. That's not what we're trying to do. But we're actually trying to create possibilities for a different kind of online experience that responds to what young people are saying. And it's that they're already on these social media or TikTok or Twitter or Instagram or Reddit or all the number of things that they do. And it's like, how can we infuse those spaces to be more hospitable and caring? And that call on young people and recognize their role as carers and very savvy about picking up other people's cues. So this idea of interdependence and mutual support and community building, that's the stuff that really is my jam and gets me excited. And it's a bold vision, really, you know, because I often talk in my writing and when I'm speaking, is like, it's about world making, but creating a different world. It's not just about getting this person from this crisis through. It's actually changing the world we live in. And that's, I think, what I'm excited about. And there's some cool people on our project. And I just read, did either of you read that piece I tweeted out a few weeks ago by Billy Ray Belcourt? He's a Indigenous poet. Oh my God! It was.
I don't think I did.
Yeah, I should send you the link so you can tweet it out. It's so good. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Adding it to my reading list.
Are you doing work on that project with We Matter at all?
Not explicitly, but I've been very involved with a project with my Indigenous colleagues here called Wise Practices. And we created a website that, again, foregrounded the knowledge and wisdom of what communities were already doing and saying that they found helpful. And the research and the formal kind of scholarship took a back seat. It was way in the background. It was in there. but it's leading with the language of life, leading with the language of community relationships. And so we featured, I think, 4 or 5 different communities doing very different things. Yeah, those are the kind of projects I want to sign up for. Yeah.
I love it. It's really amazing.
Go ahead.
Which one? Are we going to flip a coin? What's going to happen?
You go.
All right. I'm trying to talk more. It's really amazing to hear the way that people talk about online communities, you know, because I mean, historically it's been, don't get axe murdered, you know, the internet's dangerous. I have found the most kind, caring people on the internet. It just, when you don't have your people where you are, you need to find them. And online is where you find them.
Yeah.
My oldest friends in the world came from the internet. Like, I have 3 different communities that I can think of where there are people who knew that I was suicidal, who helped me through it. Some of them were also suicidal. We had things in common. I'm still friends with these people like 20 years later.
Wow.
To completely ignore that, to me, is such a terrible oversight. And, you know, it's just another thing suicidology does. And it's like, you have this amazing resource right here, and you're yelling about the dangers of social media.
I agreed 100%.
It's a shame.
Yeah.
I was asking about We Matter because I met Tinshire Redvers at an event, and they just really are a pretty incredible force, really willing to challenge colonialism in some like big, difficult ways. I was super excited to meet them. So I was wondering if they were involved in stuff. I'll post the We Matter campaign. It's an Indigenous campaign that's run out of Canada.
Excellent. They've done such a great job.
Yeah.
Sunshine is on our wish list too.
It's on our wish list to have on here. I think they're doing some other stuff. They've left We Matter and are doing some other stuff now, so I'm not sure what their space is right now. But I would love to have them on. I feel like I have so many more questions, and we're running out of I
don't like this.
5 minutes. So are there any really big important things that you want to say, or things that you wanted to get to talk about before we wrap up, or should I just try and pull one more question out?
I feel so grateful for your curiosity and for your questions and for your interest in this work, and I feel like we're connected in lots of ways that we didn't even know it until we we met on Twitter too.
Yeah.
Right? Another example of great people that you can meet on Twitter.
Yeah.
And through our CritSui hashtag, that's kind of, I think we need to get it revitalized after the conference. It kind of took the wind out of our sails, but I think we need to revitalize it. But I'm excited about where we can take that work. And I just wrote something for the what's it called? The Social Epistemology Reply Collective. It's kind of a interesting journal, but it was all about the next step for us as critical suicidology is to actually engage with scholars from outside the global north and to not be so reliant on Euro-Western theories. And there's a piece in there quite a bit about epistemological injustice and epistemic justice and the need to engage other ways of thinking and other knowledge systems. So I'm totally always thinking for that, pushing it.
I was very sad about the critical suicidology conference not happening. And I wanted to meet everyone. It felt like I was like, oh, these are going to be my people. And then also I'm just a very big Vicki Reynolds fangirl, and I was excited to see her speak. Bringing conversations about ethics in the way that she does into this work is so important, I think. So
I don't know how we could not be talking about ethics in this work. Tell me about another fucking assessment.
I know.
I didn't get to finish the chapter you sent us.
Oh yes, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I didn't get to finish the chapter, but I love it so far. I love how you call out Thomas Joyner all the time at every opportunity. I
Yep.
see you.
It makes the work a little bit easier for us to engage in the critique, I must say.
Oh, yeah, that domination of the interpersonal theory of suicide in the field is just so frustrating to me.
Yeah. He definitely has a lot of influence.
Yes.
In the field. Yeah.
How did you? Go ahead.
Oh, I've been talking about like making a little like wall decoration that's all of my rejection letters from Thomas Joyner from Suicide and Life-Threatening Behavior, where he tells me that work adds nothing to the field. like wow, okay.
But I think it was that editorial that he wrote, I can't remember, that got everybody so incensed to say that there was no place in the field for qualitative research.
Yeah.
No good could come of that. And yeah, I mean, just the kind of the embodied masculinist kind of certainty that is rooted in this one kind of knowledge. It's like, it needs to be critiqued.
Yep.
Yes. Specifically, I can't remember the phrasing about, how he was saying that anyone who was suicidal was it deranged? Yes.
Yeah.
Disordered.
Pathological derangement.
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yeah, that's his article.
Yeah,
he's a very nice man, but his daddy issues are like really coming through.
Yeah. Well, I think Heidi Hjelmeland from Norway does an amazing job of critiquing that theory of suicide, and particularly its gendered lens, and that his theory seems to be predicated on an idea of men dying by suicide that doesn't, fit.
Yeah.
Always.
I love Heidi's work. Yeah, I love her work. It's so great. Yeah, I think there's this big push right now around making like suicide crisis a disorder or a diagnosis. That's just really bizarre. I'm like, what? This is the stuff we're focusing on right now? Like this is the thing. This is what we're putting all of our energy behind. Kind of blows my mind.
Well, you got to get an insurance code out of it now. Come on.
Oh, it's so frustrating.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing that people, we sometimes forget about too, is most young people who are suicidal or attempt suicide, they don't even show up to get mental health services. And even if they do, they might stick around for 1 or 2 sessions. So there's so many things we need to be doing. Like even if we had the best in the world that was reliable and great and responsive, young people aren't going there.
Yeah.
So that's the other reason to say we need other alternatives, and we need things that don't always require expert intervention.
Yeah. I think that's true about adults too, right? The average number of therapy appointments a person will attend is 1, which is probably because intakes are so heinous and not about the person at all. But there's a lot of stuff there. It's like we can't rely on a mental health system that people don't trust and don't utilize to be their intervention.
There's some great therapists out there doing fabulous work, but like I said, let's not put all our eggs in that one basket and say that's that's my piece. It's like there's got to be other possibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah. How many people can't even get into that basket?
Right.
Yeah, we can't even serve all the people. Like even if everyone did want to go seek therapy, we don't have enough providers to serve all the suicidal people. Yeah.
Right. So lots of inequities there for sure. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for being on here. This was awesome. It was really great. I just love being around people who share good ideas, and we should have you back on again sometime, or maybe some of the colleagues from the the Critical Suicide Studies Network. Start adding some more people.
There's a great crowd there of people to interview. And thank you so much for inviting me. It's really been a pleasure for me too to chat with you. And as I say, I've appreciated the conversation and I've learned a lot too.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've learned a lot from you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. I'm ending it. Bye, y'all.
Bye.